Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Norwich Talk for another managerial related video. The past two videos have been fairly negative, as there's sort of mostly been me whinging and whining about how Norwich City needed to change and how they did. Obviously, Dean Smith was sacked. In between then, they've played twice, fairly poorly, twice under Alan Russell. It was never going to be him, was it? We're looking at a very likely appointment as it stands. It could change today. That David Wagner, formerly of Huddersfield, formerly of Schalke, formerly of Borussia Dortmund 2, like Daniel Farke, formerly of, most recently, I think it's BSC Young Boys, the team in Switzerland who you might recognise from the Champions League every so often, well, every year, really. That appointment is looking very likely, as I said. We're going to discuss it in this video, of course, but what I want to do quickly is outline. I don't really know where I sit on this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you my sort of slightly negative thoughts. I'm going to give you my slightly more positive thoughts, and then maybe towards the end we'll draw a conclusion. But to me, that doesn't seem likely. It is most likely going to be me just sort of pondering and asking you a few questions in the comments down below. Maybe you can help me decide, because I'm going to be honest, I'm not always dead certain on everything, but I kind of feel like that creates more interesting content, more open-ended to say the very least, which, yes, please, let's discuss it in the comments as we have been throughout sort of the past couple of videos. So, David Wagner. Initially, I think kind of uninspiring in terms of the stature of name, but when you break it down and you listen to, for example, the most recent Pink and Pod, it's one that you can get more behind. Initially I thought, Stuart Webber's mate from Huddersfield seems like quite a lazy option, and you hear about the 12-month rolling contract that Nick Masheter reported and you think, seems a bit like a low risk, high reward type thing. Not so much as Daniel Farke was, in the sense of he was given, a 3 or 4 year contract initially. It might have been a 2-year contract, but it wasn't a 12-month rolling contract, is my point. There was a bit more, if you can sort of use this phrase, faith invested into him. But you break it down, and David Wagner isn't the worst option. Now, if you're against the appointment, I implore you to hear me out. If you don't want to, fair enough. If you're for and you hear me say something against, again, stick with me. I think the scales might balance themselves out. But I want to start on a positive note, in the sense of not dumbing down. Dumbing down's the complete wrong phrase. Sort of watering down maybe the criticism that has been he's failed at the last two clubs he's been at. In the sense of, the first thing I immediately did was look at the state of Schalke, look at the state of that team in Switzerland, because I don't necessarily want to say look at the state of Young Boys. So I'm just going to say the team in Switzerland. And you kind of draw the conclusion that before and after the appointment of David Wagner at Schalke, that club was in a complete mess. They were finishing really low in the Bundesliga. They got relegated after he got sacked. They bounced back up and they're now bottom of the league again. Where have we seen that before? So you kind of get the gist and the idea that that club isn't right as a whole, in terms of competing at the top level in Germany. And as Norwich City fans, I feel like we can understand that situation, how sometimes it can reflect on a manager that they aren't actually that bad. It's just the finances, the players, the recruitment, what have you, don't go in your favour to go and achieve said goals. So I would recommend very highly. So it was Connor, Paddy. I think it might have just been Connor and Paddy. Maybe Adam. I think it was Connor and Paddy who made a very good podcast where they went into a bit more detail about his time at Schalke. I would very much recommend that. At Young Boys, it's very much been a case of, if you don't win the league, you'll get the chop. He didn't win the league. However, he played in the Champions League. He beat Manchester United, which at the time wasn't a particularly hard challenge. But nonetheless, when you think of the quality of Swiss football, you think more of the Premier League, don't you? Of course, especially Manchester United, who had Ronaldo in that team, and the likes of 70 million Jadon Sancho, etc., etc. So they'd obviously, done all right in that competition. However, I kind of compare that in my head and prepare for me to go full fan here, who doesn't care what, or doesn't have a reputation to uphold. I compare it to Mauricio Pochettino at PSG, where if you aren't winning literally everything available to you, you're going to get the job. So bearing that in mind, I think the idea that he's failed at both his previous clubs is not redundant by any means at all, but maybe we should take a bit of weight off that and put it onto other arguments. The other arguments being he got sacked as a Premier League manager, but then the combat to that is he kept Huddersfield up for a season. And I think Connor described it perfectly on his podcast, where he basically said Wagner was burnt out in the Premier League. That very much seems like that was the case. You know, they spent, what was it, 11 odd million pounds on Alex Pritchard, and that went horrendously. So and especially again, as Norwich City fans, when you spend a bit more money on a player and you don't see it work out, you almost have sympathy for the manager, because we've seen it time and time again. Especially when maybe you aren't in control of transfers yourself and you're working under a sporting director, which he wasn't working under Stuart Webber at that time, because, you know, Webber, for all of his criticisms and or his critiques, at the moment, he wouldn't spend £11 million on Alex Pritchard, but then he would spend a lot of money on other players that we don't necessarily like. So maybe let's just hold on to that point for now. But he's done one thing, and I feel almost scared saying this and bringing it up, but he's done one thing that Daniel Farke, the man who we're still longing for, he's done one thing that he hasn't, which is keep a team in the Premier League. And sure, maybe the finances were different, but at the same time, finances don't mean everything. And Daniel Farke, at 1.5 attempts, I don't think it was ever going to be successful for him last season, but essentially in 2 attempts, David Wagner has done what Daniel Farke couldn't. So in theory, is he more successful? Daniel Farke won the Championship twice. David Wagner went up via the playoffs, but then he kept Huddersfield in the Premier League for a season. Daniel Farke couldn't do that. It's a very interesting discussion to sort of have amongst ourselves, and I don't know what the conclusion is. The conclusion is going to have to be, let's see what Wagner does for Norwich. But I think some of the reaction that there has been is borderline unnecessary. I think frustrations towards maybe Stuart Webber and the recruitment have spilled over onto sort of the management debate and David Wagner personally, in the sense of just being a bit sick of the model and a bit sick of the lack of communication. For what it's worth, I think Stuart Webber's interview with Sky Sports was pretty good. There are a few sort of dodgy headlines that I thought were a bit clickbaity, but that's the world we live in these days. And I thought it was better than, or the interview, the standard of it was better than what it was sort of portrayed as by those headlines. But yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on that. In terms of the style of play, you know, I was never too well informed until I did a bit of research and had a little bit of a think back to those times. But we're often being told, think of heavy metal, think of Jurgen Klopp style football. I think that's what Norwich could really do with, in the sense of Dean Smith pointed it out as a criticism of his team, which was they didn't get in the opposition's face enough. They weren't sort of hard enough on the pitch. David Wagner has a reputation, so it seems, in both the Premier League and the Championship as being that type of team. So that sounds quite good. I think a big thing as well that goes in his favour and makes me sort of pleased, essentially, to see him to be named as Norwich City manager, is the idea of connection between the fans and himself. You know, he had, and there's been many clips circulating of his sort of more aggressive and free-form style of the Olays post-match after winning a game at Huddersfield. That's something we've been crying out for. It's something we were never really used to, but under Daniel Farke, it was something that we did become used to. We became accustomed to it, and we love it. And basically, we've not had it for 14, 15 months. So to be deprived of it, to have it weekly, to then be deprived of it for that long, especially during darker times as Norwich City fans, not that it's the end of the world, but realistically at the moment, it's been quite a painful time to be a Norwich fan. The idea that we're going to have someone who will come in and front it and try and build that connection is quite exciting. And yeah, in theory, the style of football that he plays is outlined, it's there. But at the same time, it's all good in theory, isn't it? But yeah, there is that argument of the past 2 clubs he's been at, he's not been able to make it work. So that's kind of where, in my head, I'm going round and round and round. By no means necessary am I disappointed or anything, but yeah, it's just a bit like, ooh, I don't quite want to go all in on this and look silly. One thing that I do think will sort of work in our favour is the idea that Webber and him are mates. Now, that's being used as a criticism, which I think is fair enough. It does, from the outside, make it seem like a slightly lazy appointment, but when I think about it a little bit more, I think of the idea that Well, if they are good mates and they have a good connection and they have been successful for a season or two before, maybe that will imply that, for example, Stuart Webber will give a little bit more to the job and maybe try and do his job better. Now, I'm not accusing him of not trying to do his job properly under Dean Smith, but it kind of felt like that. And the idea that there's now a personal stake for him, and it sounds really, I don't know, it sounds a bit like a reckless, childish point, but the idea that he's helping his mate, the idea that there is now a connection between manager and sporting director once again, might imply that he does his job better. Yeah, it's wishful thinking, but I think it's well worth considering when it comes to judging and thinking about the appointment from sort of the idea beyond it just being a mate hiring a mate to do a job. Essentially, yeah. But yeah, that's kind of my thoughts. Probably more positive than negative. By no means is it me trying to convince you to like the appointment. By no means is it me trying to turn you against it. I'm still on the fence, but at this point, the problems at Norwich City run deeper beyond just the manager. Getting rid of Dean Smith, bringing someone like David Wagner in is a step in the right direction. Bringing a new body in, let's call it that at the very least. But recruitment needs to happen. We need to shift lots of bodies. This season is, to me, exactly like the 2016-2017 season, where there's the Premier League hangover. You're kind of thinking, well, hang on, why can't we make it work in the Premier League for a long enough period of time at the very least? And there's players in the squad who have been around a while, we like, but need to move on. I remember John Ruddy being the prime example, where Stuart Webber came in and was ruthless, didn't owe anyone anything, and ripped the squad apart, built a new one, got us into the Premier League. It didn't work. We've got to do that again. It just comes at a difficult time in the sense of, I always say this in most videos that I talk in now, Anthony Richards said we need to get promoted to afford players, essentially. Otherwise, we're going to have a bit of a fire sale. You then get bogged down in the, well, hang on, if we don't get promoted, are we in trouble? Who's going to want to buy our players for the fees that we need to generate to buy players? You get into that debate, and I mean, that's about all you can say without constantly repeating yourself. So yeah, they are my thoughts. I'm surprised I've kept this under about half an hour, because in my head today I've just been going round and round and round and just thinking, is it good? Is it not? Still unsure. But yes, as I said, they're my thoughts. I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments down below. If not Wagner, then who do you want it to be? It's going to be Wagner at this point. If you want to give the video a thumbs up too, that'd be greatly appreciated. So I'll see you again in the next one.